Hello students, today I am going to discuss a new chapter, the friction. In the last chapter, we have discussed friction as a part of contact force and what is a frictional force. So let's start from that. Let's recall those things which have learned in the chapter force. What is a friction? We have learned that friction is a resistance to motion of one object relative to other. Or friction is a force between two surfaces that are sliding each other or try to slide each other. And friction force is always acting opposite to the direction of the motion. And this friction force arises due to the contact between two surfaces. These are the things we have learned already about the friction. Now let's discuss some more details about the friction force. Out of that first one we are going to discuss is that how to measure the strength or magnitude of the friction force between two surfaces. So to understand how to measure, let's perform an activity. Okay, so let's get into that activity. So let's start the activity. Here I have taken a duster and this duster is attached to a spring balanced by a thread. Now I am going to apply force on this duster with the help of this spring balance. So you can see that when I apply force, slowly the reading get increasing. That means the applied force is increasing, clear, but still that duster is at rest, clear. Why it is still at rest? Because the applied force is not sufficient to overcome the frictional force. That means frictional force is greater than the applied force. Because of that, it is still at rest. Now, when I increasing the force slowly, at a particular point, you can see that it is start to move. Clear. Why this duster begins to move? Because my applied force is equal to the frictional force applied in the opposite direction. That means the two forces are cancelled each other. So the reading in the spring balance at this point, that means when the duster just begin to move, will give the measure of frictional force. Now if I increase the force, obviously the applied force exceed the frictional force, it will move continuously. Okay, so this is a simple activity we can perform to show how to measure the magnitude of frictional force. Clear? Now let's see what is spring balance. Spring balance is a simple device used to measure the force acting on an object. It consists of a coiled spring. Clear? This is a spring you can see here, and which gets touched when a force exerting on it. You can see here when I apply force, the spring gets structured and the pointer on this scale will give the measure of friction force, because the stretching of the spring will be directly proportional to the force applied on it. That means when the applied force increases, the stretching of spring also will increase, so that the pointer will be moved forward further. Okay, so that it will give the measure of force exerting on an object. Now we have discussed how to find or how to measure the magnitude of the frictional force. Now let's discuss what causes this friction, or what is the cause of frictional force, or from where the friction force arises. Just examine the same experiment. We have the surface of table and the surface of brick. If we examine the surface of brick and table by a microscope, we can see that there are a lot of irregularities present on the surface of table as well as on the surface of brick. And when these two surfaces are coming in contact with each other, these irregularities tend to lock each other. By this way, it opposes the motion of one object if it is sliding over the another object. That means the irregularities present on the surface create frictional force. That means friction force is caused by the irregularities on the surface. Okay, then what will happen if the object is pressed on the surface? For example, if you are trying to push a box with your hand, you will experience some frictional force which opposes the motion of the block. Now, if another block is placed over the same block, what will be the result? You will feel more difficult to pull the box or push the box. This is because when the second box is placed on the first box, the surface of the block pressed on the surface of ground or on the table. That means when the object is pressed on the surface, the contact point between the surfaces will get properly locked. That means the locking will be more. This results the increasing in the friction. This is the one more thing we need to remember about it. That means when the mass of or weight of the object increases, the friction force acting between the two surfaces also will be increased. Now, what are the factors affecting on the friction? We already said that friction is caused by the irregularities present on the surfaces which are in motion. So, surface is the main factor which affect the frictional force. To understand this, let's perform another activity. So, let's take a cardboard piece or any other rectangular plane surface, okay, and just place it on a table in which that cardboard piece should be inclined to the table. Then take a pencil cell and just release the pencil cell from the top of the cardboard. Then let that pencil cell allow to move down. Then you just notice the distance covered by the pencil cell over the table as shown here. Now, let's repeat this activity by changing a small criteria. That is, just to take a cloth and spread it over the table. Then release the pencil cell as we did in the first case. In this case also, if you notice the distance covered by the pencil cell over the table, we can observe that the distance covered by the pencil cell in the second case is less than the distance covered by the pencil cell in first case. This is because in the first case, the friction force exerted between the surface of pencil cell and the table was less compared to the friction force exerted in the second case. What is the reason here? Here in the second case, on the table we spread a cloth. That means after spreading a cloth, the surface become little rough than in the first case. So finally we can conclude is that the friction force depends on the nature of the surface. That means whether the surface is smooth or rough. Why this difference happen? Because in case of smooth surface, the irregularities present on the surface will be less. So this less irregularities will result in the less tendency to lock into each other. This results the lesser friction. For example, a ball rolls and cover greater distance on a smooth surface like a wet surface or oily surface. Similarly, a rough surface have more irregularities, and these more irregularities on the surface leads to more tendency to lock between the surface, which results in the greater friction. This is the way how on the rough surface friction force will be more. For example, a ball rolls slowly and cover less distance if it moves on the sandy playground. You can observe this. Okay, so finally we can conclude is that nature of the surface is the main factor which affect the frictional force. Now let's discuss the types of frictional force. First there are three types we are going to discuss. One is static frictional force and kinetic or sliding friction, rolling friction. What is static friction? The word static means at rest, stationary. What is a static friction? The force required to overcome friction at an instant when an object starts to moving from the rest will give the measure of static frictional force. That is, consider an object is at rest and how much force is required to make that object move from rest. That will give the measure of friction, static friction. That means that will be the static friction. And what is sliding friction? Sliding friction means the force required to keep the moving object with the same speed is a measure of sliding friction. That means how much force is needed to make the object move with the same speed. For example, an object is moving. If you didn't apply any force, obviously it will come to rest because of the friction force exerted by the ground or by the air, any agency. But if you apply continuously a small amount of force, the object will continue to move with the same speed. So which will give the or which will be the or which is the sliding friction or kinetic friction? Kinetic means its meaning is moving. So there is a slight difference between static and sliding friction. For example, why is it easier to move a box that already in motion than to get started? That means if an object is in motion, then it is easier to move the object in the same direction than to get started from the rest. This is because when the box starts sliding or moving, the contact point on its surface do not get enough time to get into lock because it is already moving. If it is at rest means properly locked, but at this moment of moving, in the contact point on the surface do not get enough time to lock. This is the reason why the sliding friction is slightly less than the static friction. So it is very easier to move an object that already in motion than to get started. That means to bring from rest to motion. Now the third type of friction force, that is rolling friction. What is rolling friction? You might have seen that some people are carrying travel bags with wheels attached to the bottom part of the bag. You know what is the reason? Because when we use these types of bags, it is very easier to pull than if you are pulling a bag without a wheel. That means just simply sliding. So in that case, the wheels move over the surface is not a simple sliding. It is but rolling. So this rolling will reduce the friction force between the surface. Clear? So when a body rolls over the another body, the resistance to its motion is called a rolling friction. So in this case of travel bags, sliding friction is replaced by the rolling friction by attaching a wheel. Nowadays we are using this concept of rolling friction in machineries and other instruments in which its part should be moved continuously. So that means we can reduce the amount of frictional force if you are using the concept of rolling friction. Ball bearing is used mainly to replace the sliding friction by rolling friction in machineries. How the ball bearing works means ball bearing has two layers, and in between the two layers to covering, there are many small balls present, which you can see even in your handle part of the bicycle. You can see the ball bearings in all the instruments which have the rotating part. So how the ball bearing works means when the inner core moves, the balls also rotate continuously as seen here, so that the sliding between the stationary part and the moving part will be replaced by rolling. In this animation, these all balls are just rotating about a particular axis, but in reality these balls rotate and also it revolves around the moving axis. Okay, moving part of the machinery. Because this animation is not that much appropriate one, you can search in other medias. You will get a clear animation about how the ball bearings works. Okay, so this is all about the basic first part of the friction. So what are the things we have discussed? How to measure the friction force, and what are the factors affecting on the friction force, and the types of the frictional force. In the next part, I will discuss the effects of the frictional force and the frictional force exerted by the fluids. So, thank you all.